Welcome to episode 59 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's #1 open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and on this episode, we are taking a trip to Germany, but not the entire country. We're headed to the east side, where we will revisit the Eastern German camera industry. During the years before, during, and after World War II, East Germany was home to one of the largest camera-producing areas of the world. During the early part of recording this episode, we struggled with a plethora of technical difficulties, so we never got a chance to record a proper intro. But everyone was here: Anthony, Paul, Theo, and Mike, joined by our #1 fan, Robert Rodoloni, and first-time caller, Mark Gordon. Let's get to it.
Are we recording?
Oh yeah, we've been recording this whole time.
Good.
This is going to be the most nonsensical episode ever.
Good.
So what were we talking about again?
Whereas
Veras, that's right.
Veras.
Vera threes.
You know, of all the brands that we could talk about, if we were to do, for one, it'd be impossible, but if we were to do an episode on all the different Dresden area or East German camera companies, for one, it'd be confusing as hell because so many of them got bought out, merged, combined. I mean, that happened in other countries too, but there's just so damn many of them. We just thought, like, hey, let's try cover some of the big hitters in East Germany, Eastern Germany, and East Germany, because the industry existed prior to the war. Dresden was, for many years, and probably still is today, was a huge hub for manufacturing. It was a very good strategic location for Germany to have a lot of railroads and manufacturing of all kinds. They had technical institutes, some of the Germany's brightest engineers and mechanicals, people that built large, big things and tiny little gears for cameras would study universities near there. I don't know. I've never been there, so I don't know like all the geometry or geography of it. But in, I think it was February 45, I think the Allies just bombed the ever-living shit out of it. I mean, they just carpet bombed the entire area. I mean, the Americans even admitted afterwards that they went overkill on it. They just kept dropping bomb after bomb after bomb, and just to obliterate it, because for one, it was hard to get that deep into Germany earlier in the war, but when they finally did, it was to end once and for all any manufacturing that Germany had to keep making weapons and such for.
They made a lot of weapons there. They made tanks, they made cannons there, everything. But it had not been hit during the war because it was too far away. Like you said, it was too far distance. Finally, they had the fuel tanks to get there. So the people in Dresden thought they were safe. They weren't going to get bombed, right?
Yeah.
And they had no shelters, no nothing. And the British came through at night, because the British did their bombing at night. And they came through with 200 or 300 Lancasters and started everything going. Then the Americans came through in the morning, about 8 or 9 hours later. So the two countries just totally obliterated Dresden. Supposedly, what's his name? Goebbels passed the word around that 200,000 people were killed, but that was a lie, because that's what Goebbels did for a living. But the actual number killed was around 25,000.
Yeah,
which is nothing compared to what we did. The firebombing in Tokyo killed 100,000. So.
Yeah. But I mean, so it crippled their war effort. But this being a camera, we're camera guys. It definitely damaged a lot of the not as many as you'd think, though. Like I was actually surprised in all the studying I did. Factories like KW were able to resume operations fairly quickly after the war. Some of them were in Friedel, which is near Friedel, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is nearby. So a lot of the factories that were kind of on the outskirts of Dresden were spared, but not all. But and then of course the Soviet Union moved in after the war was done. They wanted their war reparations, and right. We've talked on this show how they acquired Zeiss's factory where they produced the contacts, and turned that into the Kiev. But we thought we'd kind of shelve Zeiss and Zeiss Icon for this show, only because there's so much to discuss there. We could spend multiple episodes talking about Zeiss,
except for the Vera.
For the Vera, yeah. And what's interesting, I think we mentioned this in a previous show. The Vera, although a Zeiss creation, is not Zeiss Icon. It's just truly Carl Zeiss Jena that was built where they made lenses. They had a bunch of these guys that were there that weren't being utilized. The Soviet Union didn't need camera technicians. When they moved production from Dresden to Ukraine for the Kiev, I think they took some of the like head engineers with, but mostly used them to train Soviet workers. So they did not, although they moved the factory and they moved the equipment, they did not take most of the technicians. So in the years after the war, when things were kind of up and running in Ukraine, there was a lot of these technical guys in Germany that were just sort of sitting around. And I don't know the full story behind it, but apparently they decided, hey, let's make our own camera and let's try something new that didn't look like anything else that ever existed. That's why the Vera is such a unique looking camera. It's got, you cock the shutter by rotating a ring around the shutter. Some of the later models have interchangeable lenses. They have ones with rangefinders. They have ones with meters. They even had a prototype SLR. They were going to try and turn the Vera into an SLR, but it never actually got made. But Anthony, you have the one, right? The original model.
Yeah, I have the very first version before it had the Tessar that has
Yeah.
like a I believe it's a triplet of some sort in it.
Yeah.
And you cock it with the ring around the lens. And then it's at least on the first version that I have. I mean, I love the camera. The camera, if you've never held one of these before, they actually look like they could have been made by Apple. They've got
Yeah.
this incredible sleek design. It doesn't, I mean, it looks like a prototype of a camera that wouldn't actually be a camera. The original version had this lens cap that doubled as a lens hood, where it looked kind of like this cone shape, and you unscrew it and unscrew the front disc and then screw it back on, and you had this funky lens hood on it. Only thing on mine, and I'm assuming it's because it was the very first version, the film rewind mechanism will actually just skin your thumb as you try to rewind it. It's this sort of like cross-hatched aluminum that you have to put your thumb down and press down and twist it. And I understand that the later models are not nearly as difficult to rewind, but I always load a short roll of like 18 into my Vera because I get so sick and tired of trying to rewind it. But other than the I can see Theo's holding up a later version and it has a standard rewind crank on it. So
Yeah, this is the two.
they definitely learned their lesson on that first model. But it was kind of like a Volks camera, and that it was like a fairly cheaply made camera, but it punched way above its weight limit, so to speak, and that it actually, even with the triplet, it produces very pleasing results, and it's a fun camera to use.
It is.
It's really got it's charming, and I've always wanted to pick up some of the later versions. Like I really want a rangefinder version of it with the Tessar. One of these days I'll find one.
I have the I can't remember which version I have, to be honest with you. I think it's called the Vera Automat, and it has both the rangefinder and the interchangeable lens mount. I have a couple different lenses for it, and the shutter works. The lenses are good. The body's in great shape. It's not hard to rewind, but the one thing that's broke on it is the rangefinder. It's got, I think it's called a split field is what it's called. It doesn't use a beam splitter. So like the rangefinder patch is actually like an optical piece of glass. And when it goes out, it turns into a black rectangle. So when you look through the viewfinder, like on most rangefinders, when the rangefinder fails, you just see right through it, or it becomes incredibly faint. But on this one, you have the opposite, where it becomes opaque. So it's unusable. But I did shoot a roll in mine, and I just scale focused it, and like yours, Anthony, I agree, it produced really, really sharp results. I mean, and that makes sense if you consider this is one of the world's only cameras made by a lens factory. Usually it's the other way around. Camera makers produce lenses, or lens companies just sell their lenses to camera companies. But Carl Zeiss Jena is where pretty much only lenses were made. And then some of these guys just decided to create their own camera. So you have a camera basically designed around a lens system. And even the triplets, like you said, are extraordinarily good.
And even advancing it with that ring around the lens is surprisingly satisfactory.
I agree. And what's kind of weird is the motion I take is when I'm holding it, I have my right index finger operates the shutter release. My left hand kind of cradles the focus wheel. But when it's time to cock the shutter, I just kind of move my left thumb and index finger back to grip the ring. And I twist the camera kind of like I'm like partially twisting the body and then twisting the ring. You guys on the call can see me. I'm lifting my elbows, but you're essentially cocking it in one swift motion like this, snap, like this, snap, is snap, like look like a bird. But if you try that, I don't know if that's how you do it, but part of your finger is rotating the lens a little bit, and then the other part is actually rotating the body the opposite direction, and you end up with the full motion. And
That's pretty much how I do it as well. Or I'll
Yeah.
just like sort of hold it in front of me and hold the ring around the lens and just sort of quickly snap the camera back and forth.
yeah,
put it
because
back up.
if you only rotate the ring, you almost have to lower it from your eye and then
Yeah.
rotate it. But if it's to your eye without having to lower it much, your right hand's already holding the body, so you rotate the body counterclockwise, and then with your other hand you rotate the ring the other half of the way clockwise, and it equals a full motion. So it's kind of weird, but that's the appeal of the camera, is the sleekness of it. And the top plate of the one you have, it doesn't even say Vera on it at all.
No.
Like there's literally a button and that's it, and there's nothing else on that camera.
And it has the khaki green covering on
Yep.
it too, which is
In fact, the later models, the more they added to it, in a way kind of got away from the original appeal, because it originally was so sleek and clean, and as they added more features, it's sort of lost a little bit of that.
I think the 2 was the one where they really hit the pinnacle with that, because they added enough just to make it, so you're not skinning your fingers trying to rewind it and so on. But they hadn't added all those extra bits to it.
Yeah.
And I agree. As they progressed through it, they just added stuff that sort of made it less sleek.
But if you're a collector and you're the kind of person that likes variants, if that's the kind of thing you're into, a model that has like 8,000 different versions, the Vera is an ideal candidate, because they
Who
made
would
a
do
whole that I think if Vlad Kern wasn't a Soviet collector, he might be a Vera collector, because there's a whole bunch of them to have.
some of the later ones, they kind of got kind of like modern, sleek, mid-century modern looking. Like there's one of them that has these like horizontal stripes, and it looks a little bit like the Zeiss Icon Voigtlander Vitesse K1000.
Well, that was the last version. That was the Weramatic.
Yeah.
And
That's the one I have.
The difference between the Weramat and the Weramatic was the Weramatic, I believe, showed you the exposure meter in the viewfinder.
Oh, then I don't have that one. Maybe I have
You
the Vera matte.
Then. That's the matte.
Yeah, I have the matte then. Okay.
And then they changed, like you said, they these optical engineers can't leave well enough alone, so they'd make variations of models without changing the actual name. You could have different the same camera with some different features.
Interesting. We mentioned Carl Zeiss Jena because they did make lenses, and before we sort of move off them, one of the most iconic lenses from East Germany, obviously the Biotar, the 5. I've got the 5.8 centimeter version here, which this is the M40 version. And the reason why I bring that up, apart from being the absolutely amazing lens to shoot with, and I've adapted it to Micro Four Thirds, so it becomes a perfect portrait lens. Is you had one of the early cameras from there is the Practiflex, one of the early SLRs. Just interesting. I wouldn't exactly say it's something that you really need to go searching for, but it's interesting camera, the Practiflex with the M40, very short-lived mount, but a lot of fun to shoot with.
Here's a Contax D, which has the Biotar on it, the 5.8 centimeter.
Oh yes. That would be the M42 mount.
Yeah, that's M42, right? Yeah. The Biotar was a heck of a lens. It really was.
Mine has the Meritar.
Meritar? Okay.
Yeah, because I think I took the Biotar off and I'm shooting it. This one is in the permanent collection. So, but that Biotar, I agree. That's my all-time favorite lens. I mean, I like that lens. It's just a great.
Then a lot of them came with the Carl Zeiss Jena Tessar, F28 Tessar.
Right.
A lot of them.
I have a you like Biotars. This is called an Ihagee Parvola, which has a Biotar on it. So this is a 127 folding camera that has a comp relief shutter with a Jena Biotar.
I had no idea they were making it that far back.
Yeah. You can even get them for robots. They made biotarts for the robot too. Theo, you mentioned the Practiflex, and Practiflex was made by KW. If I wanted to highlight two East Germany camera makers, my two favorites would probably be Ihagee, which made the Parvola and then later the Exactas. But I also love KW for a couple of reasons. One, I like the story. There's a great story behind the creators of KW, but they made some really fascinating cameras, and they actually created the Practiflex. And a fun story. It's really, I guess, it's not fun. It's actually sad. KW was originally created by two Jewish, I think, brothers, but they created a bunch of really, really cool cameras. Like they had a TLR, a 127 KW reflex TLR, which was cool. What, Paul? What was that KW that you said you didn't want to talk about? The really, really thin folding one.
The Etui.
Yeah, the
Etui,
Etui.
Etui. I love that camera. No,
Yeah,
I think it's the coolest camera. In fact, I've got one in the basement. It's in the eBay store right now, and I think I might take it off and keep it.
you should keep it.
It's just got a
I've
great
held
shape.
one in my hands. It's so thin, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the design on it, the way it's shaped, is just really cool.
I always thought KW was the first. So Germany was well known for making quality stuff in the early 20th century, but when you look at, I'll just say 20s and earlier, pretty much all the cameras look the same. And KW, in my opinion, was one of the first companies that tried to deviate from that and come up with new and interesting designs. In the patent etui, it's if you haven't seen it, picture like a 6.5 by 9 folding camera, like you typically see. You fold the door out, the bellows extends, but there's nothing else. Like the body completely collapses into a thin body, maybe what, inch and a half at its widest, thick. So it's incredibly small, and it would fit, in maybe like a large coat pocket, and it's sleek, and you could open it up, and it was a fully functional folding camera. They made roll film backs for it. They made plate backs for it, sheet film backs for it. So, KW had a lot of really, really cool cameras. Anthony, don't you have the Pilot, the KW Pilot?
I have mine on loan from Mike Novak.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a fun camera to shoot. Another one of these crazy folding TLR kind of cameras.
But not only does it do 127, but it's not like a 4x4, it's a 3x4.
Yeah.
So it does 127, but rectangular 127. So you actually get 16 exposures per roll. And they never put 16 exposure numbers on the backing paper for 127. So the film advance on that camera is rather awkward.
Yeah, it has a like a little lever that it's supposed to properly space
Yeah.
the right number of frames. Maybe just because it's a 90-year-old camera, it doesn't exactly hit the mark every time.
So my memory was off. KW was not founded by two brothers. It was two businessmen named Paul Guth and Benno Thorsch. Both of them were Jewish. They had manufacturing in the Dresden era. They founded the KW in 1919. The patent etui was their first product. The etui, the word etui in German actually means case in English. So they incorporated, the small size, like its body was in the name. But throughout the 20s, KW made a lot of just innovative, cool, different designs, and they were recognized for it. They actually got really popular. And so after World War I, Germany's economy was in really, really bad shape. They just didn't recover. And part of the weakness of the German economy is how the Nazi Party actually was able to kind of gain momentum. Is that, like, from a financial standpoint, they were able to resolve some of the economic problems. They obviously created others. But anyway, in 1926, the German government recognized that manufacturing was in poor shape, and the optical industry was struggling. The superiority of the German camera market the previous 20 years was really, really struggling. So the creation of Zeiss Ikon in 1926 was four of the biggest Dresden area companies, and they all merged together to create Zeiss Ikon. But KW was in that same area, and they did not merge. They had nothing to do with Zeiss Ikon because they were one of the ones that was actually doing well. So there was a short period of time in like the mid 20s where KW was probably the most successful German camera maker. Because they were doing stuff that was different from other people. So anyway, so fast forward to the 30s. You get into some of the darker eras. You have a company run by Jewish men, and they start to realize, we kind of need to get out of here. So you had Paul Guth and Benno Thorsch. Paul Guth apparently fled the country and just said, I'm getting out of here, leaving Benno Thorsch behind. And Benno Thorsch had some ties to the United States. So he traveled over to the United States and for whatever somehow wound up near Detroit. And he connected with a businessman named Charles Noble, who owned a photo finishing company. It was basically like a small camera shop. The story goes is that Benno Thorsch traded his camera factory back in Germany for Noble's photo finishing store in Detroit. And he took it, Noble being an American, was able to go to Germany and resume operation. And apparently the government didn't seem to have a problem with that. Thorsch stayed in America. Apparently he was successful there. He moved out to North Hollywood, California, and ran his own camera shop up until he died.
Studio City Camera.
Yeah. He lived to be over 100 years old.
Yeah, he was one of the great LA dealers.
Yeah. So from that end of it, you had one of the two guys who created KW. This guy saw the writing on the wall, fled Germany, was able to arrange this trade with Noble, was successful throughout the rest of his life. One of the biggest camera dealers, like Paul said, of Los Angeles. Noble, though, ended up running KW and said, hey, they have a lot of these really cool cameras, but we need to make something that nobody has. Whereas KW did a lot of cameras that were different, but at least they were similar to something else. He decided, hey, let's make a 35 millimeter SLR. The Exacta existed at that time, but the Exacta has unorthodox controls, right? It doesn't look anything like what we kind of knew SLRs to look like, in the years to come. But the Practiflex made its debut in 39. So Theo, that one you have there, do you know there's a whole bunch of different variations of it? Do you know, is yours a pre-war model? Did you ever date it?
Yeah, I did, but I haven't got that in front of me. Sorry. I'll look it up.
Is the shutter release on the front plate of the camera or the top?
It's on the front. Yeah.
Okay.
On the left-hand side.
Yeah, those are a little bit later models. The original ones, the shutter release was on the top. They actually relocated it to the front later. But you're right, though. It does use the 40 millimeter screw mount. You got to remember by that time, Lights already had been using M39 for Leicas, and the idea to make a large 42 millimeter screw mount, no one had thought of it. But basically, where I'm trying to go with this story was, if you look at that Practiflex, it's clearly an older camera, but it doesn't look that fundamentally different from what SLRs would eventually look like by everybody, right? I mean, you have the rewind knob and the typical, there you go. See, he's got the screw mount. You got the rewind knob where it belongs. You have the advanced knob where it belongs. The shutter release is relatively close to where it belongs. Even the ones that had them up front weren't that foreign. Whereas the Exacta, it's a left-handed camera. You have the slow speed governor on the right. You have the main shutter speed on the left. The Exacta, for as great as it was a bizarre camera. But the Practiflex, in my mind, was the first modern SLR, and its design influenced the Practica, which eventually became part of Pentacon, which we can talk about a little bit later. There was billions of Practicas, and those look fairly common too. So KW created the Practiflex, but it was really an American businessman running the company that created that design. So in some ways, you could kind of say that the father of modern ergonomics for SLRs was come up by an American who was running a German company. But the Practiflex was a very simple rudimentary camera, but it could be made quickly. It was made cheaply. And, the Exacta was extraordinarily expensive. Most common people couldn't afford it, but the Practiflex was at least somewhat affordable. But and then in 51, 52, Bob, they wanted to make something a little bit more professional.
Yeah.
And that's when we get to the Practina. So you have
Practina.
you have Practiflex. There's a different camera called the Practi. There's the Practica, and then the Practina. The Practina has nothing to do with any of those other ones. And Bob's got one that's loaded. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the one you're holding?
I've got more than one. I've got one with a 50-foot back on it, whatever. But the thing is, the Practina, in a way, influenced the Nikon F, believe it or not. Okay. The original Nikon F prototypes had this secondary window here like the Alpha did. Okay. The original Nikon F prototypes had this removable finder, removable back, attachable motors, removable focusing screen. It all came with this first. Nikon didn't get into that until like 57. This is the spring wound motor. I've had a couple of them. They work, but they're very tricky. Getting them to mount and work.
They're very difficult to mount.
Yeah, really. I mean, it's hot. This one I can't. If I screw it all the way in, it doesn't shoot.
What I'm going to take a break. I'm showing a picture of
Yeah.
the motor drive mount.
The lug. Yeah.
It looks very similar to the motor drive couplings that pretty much everybody else used.
Everybody else ended up using, right?
And and I don't want to get too far into this wormhole here, but if you were to look at 59, early 60s, Canon had the Canon Flex. Eventually, Minolta came up with the X1 in the early 70s. The one feature that Nikon insisted their cameras have was that external coupling for motor drive. I've asked you this question before, Bob. There's no real proof of this, but it seems entirely plausible that they were influenced by this camera.
Yeah, they were. I'm pretty sure they were.
I would be willing to bet that had this camera not had that, either Nikon just wouldn't have done it or they would have found a different way to do it.
The thing is, no one could ever figure out why Nikon had this window here and their prototypes only. They made about 3 or 4 prototypes with this window. Then they dropped the idea. But of course, Alpha had it also. But some of the other features were right out of the Practina, with the interchangeable finders, the back that came off, et cetera, et cetera. The motor from the very beginning, they also had a 50-foot back. Nikon's back, and all the 250 shot motors that were ever marketed had a 33-foot capacity. Okay, this back holds 50 feet, so it's good for about 400 frames. Then you would hook this motor under the bottom here, or an electrical motor, and you could get 400 frames out of it. Again, that was ahead of its time. This was a complete system. As a matter of fact, they even had, besides the spring wound motors, they even had an electric motor, which very few exist. And I have some missing parts on it, so I can't get it. I haven't got the charging unit, but they actually made an electric motor for this thing. And again, years ahead of its time. This is the early 50s, 51, 52, 53, something like that.
So you probably had to like carry around like a lead acid car battery or something.
Yeah, it would have been a big battery in those days. Yeah.
There were no alkalines then.
It was cylindrical and it fit on the front like this. It wasn't very hand holdable. Matter of fact, this thing, even without a motor, just the back on it is heavy as hell. Okay.
Yeah.
There's no plastic in here at all. But so they had ideas like that. You know what I mean? They had interchangeable finders of all kinds, high focus finder, waist level finders. They had everything. And this one has the meter finder on it instead of an eye level finder. It's an actual meter finder. Again, everything that Nikon eventually got into. So it was sort of like, well, I think the Nikon engineers were looking at it when they were designing theirs. They wanted to see which direction to go. They had no one else to copy but the Exacta.
Right.
They didn't want to make an Exacta.
No.
Okay. So they looked at this and they said, well, this makes more sense. The only other thing you had out at that time, of course, was the Contax. Okay. But the Contax was a good design. Very, very sleek design, very well made.
But it wasn't modular.
But the Practina was one notch above this. This had, no interchangeable finders, no motors, no nothing like that. But it was the basic Pentaprism SLR.
Right.
And the shape, as you can see, is what we got used to for 50 years. Okay.
Sure.
Into the past, plastic jelly beans came out later on that we have now. But I have the Contax and all kinds of those. And I also have this. Which one is this?
Well, that's a Contax of some kind.
It's a no-name.
It's a no-name.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a no-name.
Yeah, that's the one. But if you peel off that plate.
There is no plate.
Okay, well, you got the one that, then they sometimes they would put the plate over the top.
I had Hexagon that had that. I had Hexagon that had, but you could see it was a plate that was actually literally screwed on the front.
Yeah, I've seen it that were actually glued on.
Glued on too, yeah.
Yeah.
But this one has nothing. Nothing was ever there.
I mean, this is a much later Practica, but it's interesting. I'm looking at where the where the actual shutter button is
Same
on that
place.
one?
Yeah.
Well, it's exactly the same place, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. The Contax started it. The original Contax had this right here. The Practina took it up also. So both Practinas and Contaxes all had that. Actually, when you think about it, it's a more stable location.
It is.
As far as you're not
I
pushing
prefer,
they say it gives you more stability.
even though you are still pressing down, the advantage of any kind of front shutter release like that is when you're holding the camera already to your eye, generally like your nose might be touching it or something, but you're pushing inward pressure towards your face. So in a way, you're like you said, Robert, you get better stabilization. You can get, I'm just going to make this up, one extra stop of vibration reduction, or something like that.
I mean, you could maybe handhold it for an extra slower speed or whatever. But
yeah,
to me, it's a very comfortable location. And a few Japanese cameras did do it. Not too many.
I'll just jump in here for a second for the listeners because they obviously can't see what we're holding up here.
Until they go to Instagram.
Yeah, until they go to Instagram. But the shutter button is actually halfway down the right-hand side of the camera on the front, angled at a 45-degree angle. So you can actually, you're pulling back into it. A lot of the early East German cameras had that. And that's what we're referring to. Well, I think what Mike's saying is gives you an extra stop possibly because you're actually holding the camera on its actual body rather than trying to get your finger up on the top plate to initiate the shutter.
A couple of Japanese, I think Petri might have done it on one of their very early SLRs. They had the same location and the same angle. A couple other minor Japanese companies did it too, but none of the major guys did it.
Miranda and Topcon had the front. It was just in though,
where you're pushing right in.
Yeah, you could be right. I have the very first Petri and it's on top, but the challenge with Yashica had one like that. They did it.
Yeah.
Yashica had the angled one. But when you look at most 35 millimeter SLRs where the shutter release is put, that's already kind of a cluttered part of the camera. You usually have the shutter speed dial up there. You have the wine lever. A lot of times the exposure counter's there. In the case of cameras that were inspired by the Leica, you'd have the AR. The advanced rewind lever would be there. And, sometimes to have to fit in the shutter release, I've commented many times how I actually don't like the original Nikon F or even the Nikon rangefinders. The location of the shutter release is actually on the back edge of the top plate. And I won't say it's uncomfortable, but it's a little more comfortable the further forward it is. And to have a shutter release where the Practina has it all the way in the front, for one, there's nothing else that's there. You're not fighting with other controls. I think it's easier to locate with it to your eye.
Nikon, when they came out with their original Nikon 1 rangefinder, they all had that towards the back mounted top release, shutter release. And it had something to do with it lined up with the sprocket wheel and all this kind of stuff. It was easier to make. And they had that on the F also. So when you were holding the F, you had to have your finger like cocked backwards a little bit. They corrected that with the F2.
F2, right.
They found out that they didn't have to do it that way, and they didn't. And everybody, actually, that's one of the things that the reviewers were applauding, that they changed the location of the shutter release.
And it sounds so pedantic, and people who are listening to the show are probably like, holy shit, they're talking about like a 2 millimeter difference between the location of a shutter release. But I will tell you, pick up a Nikon F and pick up an F2, and it's not a huge difference, but it's just a little bit nicer where it's at. And then take an F2, the Nikon never did this, but then hold a Practina where it's all the way on the front and just like close your eyes, wiggle your fingers, don't do any muscle memory, and then immediately grab the camera. And I would be willing to bet more times than not, your index finger is going to land on the front of the camera, not the top.
It's very comfortable.
Very comfortable. And I think that's why so many companies continue to do that for many, many years. But for whatever reason, we'll never understand. By, I don't know, the 60s, maybe early 70s, everybody switched to a top plate shutter release.
I think it was because they wanted to try and get things closer to things like the shutter speed dials and so on, so that your finger's always just in the one spot.
Didn't the Leica screw mount cameras also have their release towards the rear edge of the camera?
Yeah, same
so
as
Nikon was basically
they were.
My Nikon shutter is a Leica shutter, so they just copied that part too.
Yeah.
So the Leica, but then when Leica came out with the M's, they put it in a more logical spot.
Right. If you like screw mount rangefinders, the later Nikkos, some of the Leotexes, the Canon did move it forward.
Yeah.
Mike, let me ask you a point of just sort of conjecture that maybe you've
Sure.
come across in your historical research. I'm looking at a list of camera industry in Dresden, and we've got Balda and Certo and Altessa and Ihagee, which apparently is industry and Handelsgeschäft, and KW, and all of these, and there's a dozen others here on this list.
There's several dozen.
One thing that strikes me is that they all tended to have radically cool different designs, and there were some like evolutionary dead ends there, but there also were camera companies that took chances on radical redesigning cameras. And I'm wondering if being in Dresden, whether there was a design culture there, or whether it was getting away from the Theo's holding up his half frame Penty, which I also love. But was it like getting away from the patent issues of Leica and Zeiss and Rolly and coming up with like different solutions? Because I know that had driven a number of issues in the camera industry that like you couldn't copy. The lawyers for Leica were fairly aggressive about enforcing copyright design. Were these just people like spitballing crazy ideas to get away from established designs?
You got to remember, Zeiss and Lights were untouchable back then. I mean, they were the undisputed heavyweight. So even before the war, when it was just Germany, Dresden was where so much manufacturing was being done. There were a lot of universities there too. So like if you wanted to become a precision mechanic, whether you wanted to make airplanes or cameras, you went to Dresden. Lights was in Wetzlar, which is what would become West Germany. And, Zeiss was in that area too, but Zeiss was all over the country. But I think what you said about the designs, they didn't want to compete. That's why no other German company made a camera that looked like a Leica. Everybody else wanted to copy the Germans, but the Germans didn't want to copy themselves. So everybody was always trying to do something different. The Lordomat, I know this is an East German episode, but the Lordomat was made in Wetzlar, right next to Leica. In fact, several key employees at Lightolf, the company who made the Lordomat, were ex-Lights employees. So they wanted to make a camera that was very, very different. They didn't want at any risk of being considered a copy of the Leica. And I think that that's kind of why you saw so many ridiculously varied designs. And amazingly, even after the Soviet Union kind of crushed many, many of those companies and merged them all into VEB Pentacon, you still saw that. Theo, hold it up again. The Penty, that little gold-plated camera. That was a Welta design, actually. It eventually became part of Pentacon, but that was originally a Welta or Velta camera. In fact, the early versions still say VEB Velta on it instead of Pentacon. So you still saw some of that cool stuff. And I think that's why cameras like the Practiflex and the Practina were nobody wanted to copy the Exacta. They wanted to make their own. And Theo's holding up something called the Penty. That's another East German design. It was Practi. Sorry, there's the Penty and the Practi. The Practi was the first alkaline battery. Well, it would have been, what was the technology before alkaline? Zinc something.
Yeah, with a motor drive.
Yeah, but it was a motor drive. It was an electric motor drive camera, 61. So there was a ton of innovation. The Germans definitely had no problem making good-looking cameras. For as strange as the Exactas are, I think they're gorgeous. I really like Exactas.
Can we talk about the glory that is Exacta right now?
Yeah. We spent a lot of time on KW, but I wanted to spend some time in the Practina. But before we switch over to the Exactas, I'll leave it here. If you want to try something cool that's old and has a great story, but still also feels a little bit modern, I can't recommend the Practina enough. The only issue, obviously, is age. It can be hard to find them in good working order, but they are out there and people can fix them. I believe the shutter was a copy of the Exacta shutter. So even if it's not a copy, I think anybody who can CLA and Exacta should be able to do a Practina. But yeah, so what did you find? What does Ihagee stand for?
Oh, hold on here. Let me bring up my translation again.
Because it's literally an abbreviation for the letters IHG. It was an acronym.
It was Industry and Handelsgesellschaft.
So say that really, really fast in Germany, or German, I mean, and it sounds really impressive. So people just shorten it to Ihagee. So in a way, Ihagee is a contraction of the abbreviation for that actual name. But Ihagee has, in my mind, one of the coolest stories. I mean, Nikon, I think, has a really cool story making cameras for the military. KW has a really cool story. You know, two Jewish men started it, sold it to an American. The Americans, you know, made the first modern 30 millimeter SLR. Then I didn't get into this, but after the war, they got sent to gulags. And then the son came back after the Berlin Wall fell and created the Noblex. So there's a really cool story with KW, but Ihagee was created by a Dutchman named Johan Steenbergen.
Right.
And one of my favorite parts of the story is that this guy was a shrewd businessman. He was a politician. He was an ambassador. This guy was like Germany's lifeline to his home country. And he created Ihagee and split it up into two completely different halves. The first half was all the intellectual parts. So all the patents, all the designs, the names. And then the other half of the company was all the capital, the factory, the physical buildings, the manufacturing equipment, all the raw materials. And he actually created them separately that way, fearing that if the German government were to ever try to take over his company, they couldn't get all of it. They maybe might get half, but he'd still have half of the company. And that's one of the primary reasons why Exacta, I keep saying Exacta, but it was really Ihagee. But when you look at pre and post-war Exactas, there's almost no Soviet influence there. The cameras just continue to be made. I mean, they modernized, obviously. They continue to evolve, but Exactas were still hot sellers as late as the late 60s. And that was a design from the 30s. And a lot of that had to do with his understanding of business, and he was able to retain ownership of the intellectual property. You know, the Germans took over his factory. You know, it became a VEB, which it stands for Volk something, I don't know. But it was you know, for East German companies run by the Soviet government, you would always see the letters VEB. That essentially means like a kind of like a corporation or something, a state-owned corporation. And Exacta was operated completely independently from any other East German company because of that tie back to the Netherlands. So, you know, the Soviet government controlled the East German camera industry, and they didn't like people telling them what to do. But one thing they did realize that they needed was money. They needed to be able to export things and bring in money from other countries. That's why a lot of Pentacons and Practicas were sold out west. They were very, very popular in the UK. We had a guest on a couple episodes ago where I asked, was buying a Practica in the 60s in the UK considered a bad thing? And I don't remember who it was we had that said that, but they're like, no, it was just the camera that you started with. So it was okay to buy East German stuff.
They must have sold millions and millions of them because, I mean, you look at any listing locally for people selling cameras and you know, out of their garages and so on, and there's always a Practica. I mean, it's usually is it the MTL 3s and 5s and so on. They're just absolutely everywhere. They must have sold quantities of that would have made even companies like Nikon and Canon jealous.
Well, wasn't Hanamex
rebranded them? Yeah,
Hanamex rebranded them. Was Hanamex Australian?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, but it was we had Hanamex in the U.S. also, and I think they were imported from Australia.
Yeah,
they were Hanamex lenses as well as cameras.
Yeah, Hanamex actually did a lot of cameras, and they seem to have a lot of ties into the East German world of cameras because there's a lot of Hanamex branded and non-branded cameras that they were actually responsible for distributing, not just in Australia, but across the US and the UK.
After the war, Steenbergen he actually moved to the United States, but became an ambassador to the Netherlands. He worked with Germany. They had a relationship that the East Germans just didn't want to risk losing. So there was sort of this like unwritten acknowledgement that Ihagee would continue to exist relatively, I'm sure they had some influence, but relatively independent of the rest of the East German camera industry. So, by like the late 50s, early 60s, almost everything had become Pentagon. Serto was gone, Balda was gone, Welta was almost gone. Even KW at some point eventually got merged and became a VEB, but Ihagee survived way longer than any other Eastern German camera maker, and it had to do with Steenbergen's connections. The fact that he actually still owned some of the intellectual trademarks that the East Germans wanted to respect, because they feared that if they didn't, I mean, technically they could have chosen not to, but that would have come at the loss of diplomatic relationships with other countries. And the one thing that East Germany lacked that West Germany had was capital. They needed money quite a bit. So what little ability they had to export things and bring in money was highly dependent on these relationships remaining intact.
Well, the same thing happened in Japan after the war. The Japanese government backed up the camera industry just like the Germans backed up their camera industry, because cameras are considered a high value export. In other words, the amount of material that goes to the camera is not worth anything compared to what you can sell it for. Okay. So it was a great source of cash flow. And both the Japanese and the Germans needed cash flow after World War II. And cameras were perfect for that, because Japan was not into other things yet, like TVs and whatever, but cameras they could make. And that was a very high, what they called a high value export. And the MIDI backed them up. And I'm sure the same thing happened in East Germany. The East German government probably realized they had nothing else to sell. Who was going to buy anything else from East Germany at that time? But they had those names. They had those great names that they could sell product. And that's what they did. They got them a lot of cash flow.
We've got a couple of guests on
Yeah, we
today,
do.
which we apart from Bob, who's always quite welcome. We haven't introduced or asked any questions there. At the moment, one of them's gone missing actually, but there's Mark G.
Yeah, hi there.
Hi,
Mark.
maybe introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm just avid hobbyist collector, and honestly, with I do listen to the podcast generally. In terms of GDR or East German cameras, that's sort of a very big interest of mine. I do have a background in terms of going to school in part. When the wall was still intact in East Germany, I sort of cut my teeth in terms of photography when I was there with Zeiss, mainly bringing back some of the lenses, some of the cameras, what have you, getting started that way. And in terms of, I did work back in the day at the State Department. So again, with trade and what have you, it's been a keen interest of mine to, as a hobbyist with cameras, to look at the history behind that, not only in terms of the photography aspect, but for example, the reparations after the war, and how basically as part of the reparations with the German, I guess, copyrights, patents, what have you, those carried over into Japan and were open up, and they were allowed to use some of their designs, what have you, across the board without, with the Japanese being able to have, as well as other nations, having that information and being able to start their industry based upon the German historically. So again, this is my first time venturing into the Zoom call that you have here, and I just thought I would jump into it tonight as opposed to waiting for it to come online. So here I am. Thank you.
Well, the benefit is you get to pick a brand and ask us a question or share anything you might know. That's the best part of the show. No one wants to hear me talk for 2 straight hours.
Some of it I'm just curious about TLRs in particular. And that's something I don't really have a lot of information about.
Yeah.
Let me just ask out loud. I mean, is there anything interesting that you can share?
Yeah, outside of Zeiss, they're like Pentagon, Praktica, KW had the Pilot TLR, which we already discussed, but that was a
Weltaflex.
There you go. There was a Weltaflex. There was
the Reflecta. Reflecta.
The Reflecta
was VEB.
There we go.
Welta. Yeah, the Reflecta was mid 50s. It was replaced by the Weltaflex in the mid 50s. It was a Reflecta from roughly 1946, I think.
But when it comes to German TLRs, I mean, Rollei would have been I mentioned earlier, you had Leitz and you had Zeiss, which were untouchable, and I probably to some smaller degree, I'd be willing to bet that the Rollei was fairly untouchable too. You didn't see there were many Japanese copies of Rolleiflexes. but you didn't see quite as many German ones that operated similarly. So a lot of the ones that you're mentioning, the Weltaflex and the Perfecta, those were fairly simpler models. I have a pre-war TLR here, which is very uncommon, called the Mentoret. This was made in the 30s, and it's very odd. It's got a pop-up sports finder on the side. This one's so strange. I don't remember how to open it. There we go. It's got a focal plane shutter, so you don't see that too often on a TLR. So it's a cloth focal plane shutter instead of a leaf shutter like you would typically see on most 6x6 TLRs. Lever wind. But this is, like I said, this is a 30s camera. So there were a few Eastern German and East Germany TLRs, just not quite as many. It didn't seem to be the dominant style of camera there than anything else. But certainly, they operated, kind of the same way. I think that Rollei just did such a good job of being the German TLR maker that's just kind of what people associated. So people just chose to compete in other markets.
Makes sense.
So, Mark, while you were I assume were you in East Berlin?
Yeah, I was actually, because I was a student, I got to study outside of East Berlin as well as East Berlin itself.
Were you developing and printing at the time that you were in East Berlin?
I was not. Ironically, though, my family background's printing. So,
because I was in East Berlin in 89, 90, and found in one of the stores Fotolinie. It was a photo paper that was high quality German linen that had been impregnated with emulsion that you could print on, and so it felt like a textured paper when you went to expose it as a print, until of course you put it into the first chemical, and then it became wet cloth. But it was a fascinating product. I'd only ever seen it in East Germany, and you could take it and you could sort of stretch it as it dried, and it looked like a canvas. It looked like you were printing photos on canvas, but you could also form it and drape it while it was wet, and it would sort of shrink to fit. So you could get like these incredibly interesting textured photo prints out of this paper. And it was something that, again, like I said, I'd only ever seen in East Germany. And I've been looking for that product, ever since, because I brought back like 300 sheets and actually did a show on prints printed on that photo linen. But I've never met another person who's ever seen it, used it, or ever heard about old stock of it. Just something that it may have just been one photo store in East Germany or in East Berlin that somehow had this product. But I've always been curious. Whenever I find somebody who was in East Berlin about that same time, I always want to ask to see if they ever saw this photo linen.
Yeah, honestly, at the time, I mean, I was in my early 20s, and I just remember being in the stores, and just because of the black market for U.S. currency, I was able to get a few M42 Zeiss lenses at a remarkable price. And
oh, nice.
And I'd been to the Soviet Union or back in the day, and so I had a Zenit camera, and I just kind of matched everything with that.
Yeah, I also bought my first. I got 18 there in East Berlin.
Oh yeah. Okay, all right.
It was a vibrant scene in East Germany. I mean, there was a lot of enthusiast camera. It was a big thing.
Yeah, the photography is remarkable at that time. Also, before they just promoted, a lot of it was just in terms of what I saw for consumer goods through Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They heavily promoted photography.
We talked about that with Vlad on the Soviet episode. Obviously East Germany was not the Soviet Union. However,
right,
they did share similar ways of thinking. And to what you're speaking about there is propaganda was huge there. So getting cameras or ways to encourage people to make photos and, that could be used to make the place look nice or whatever, I think was big. And, a lot of the cameras were, I don't want to say super affordable because, a lot of people didn't have a lot of disposable income there, but they were, the Practicas and the Zenits were within the means of someone who really wanted one. You could get one if you wanted to. And they made good images. People will say that the Jena Zeiss Tessars aren't of as good a quality as the ones made in West Germany, like Oberkochen. We were talking about the Veras. Those were Jena lenses. There's the Altix. The Altix cameras had usually East German lenses, and they make fantastic images. The Tessar is such a well-designed formula that it's difficult to screw up, so you get a Zeiss Tessar lens, no matter how simple of a camera it is. What do you have there, Theo?
I've got the Pentacon 6 TL, and that's got a biometer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct on it. Again, East German, Karl but it's I mean, I would argue with anybody that this doesn't produce absolutely fantastic pictures. I fully agree with you, Mike. I mean, the optics coming out of there were fantastic. Interesting enough, I just noticed that it's actually got the shutter button we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Back to what you were seeing there, Mark and Anthony, in East Germany, the photography scene was pretty vibrant. Just like Vlad was talking about in Soviet Union, there were a lot of people who wanted to shoot photography. They needed some of the cheaper cameras, but the cheaper cameras weren't bad. I mean, the Japanese were definitely a leg up on your typical Praktica, but it didn't instantly guarantee you'd take better shots, right? What do they say? The best camera is the one you have with you. So if you have an Agat 18 or a 3-element, whatever SLR, and that's what you got, you could make great images. You just got to know how to use it. But certainly bringing in money was a priority for East Germany. And I'll say one more thing about Ihagee. One of the neatest turns about that history is that Steenbergen stayed away from Germany throughout the first maybe 10 or so years, maybe 12 years after the war. But by the late 50s, he wanted his company back. He owned some of the rights to it. The Germans, the East German Soviet government had control over his factories and the name, but he thought, well, it's my company, damn it, I want it back. So he went in on this multi-year legal battle trying to restore him as the owner of Ihagee, and it ended up turning into something similar to what happened at Zeiss Icon. And there ended up, there's a West German Zeiss Icon and an East German Zeiss Icon. Well, the same thing happened with Ihagee. There ended up being Ihagee West and Ihagee East. And Ihagee West produced exactly 2 cameras. The first one is a camera called the Exacta Real. It has the Exacta name. It even has the same script Ihagee logo. I don't know if you can see that it says Ihagee Berlin West. So this was produced in West Berlin. So it is technically a West German camera, just produced in Berlin. It has a similar body shape, that kind of trapezoidal shape that Exactas have. It has 2 shutter releases. One on this, it's backwards on Zoom, but this is the left finger shutter release, and then there's one on the right, and both of them will fire the shutter. It has its own lens mount, so they had a larger diameter lens mount, which was one of the weaknesses of the regular Exacta mount, is that it was very narrow, so it couldn't support super fast or ultra wide angle lenses, whereas this lens mount did. It has the shutter release on the right, just like you would see from the more modern cameras, had a fast cloth shutter. So, he ended up making a camera that he thought would be the natural evolution of the Exacta. Unfortunately, it was harder to start up a new company in Germany for multiple reasons: the economic, the political, plus by the 60s, Japan was kicking Germany's ass in terms of mass production of excellent quality cameras. So the Germans were sort of, I don't want to say old school, but that's why you didn't see a whole lot of West German SLRs with focal plane shutters. They stuck with a lot of the old way of doing things, overly complicated stuff. The Lights lost money on every single Leica Flex they sold until they partnered up with Minolta in the 70s. So this camera, when it came out, was ridiculously expensive. It was complicated to build. I think it took like 6 years from when he started working on it to when it finally came out. And even by 66, when it made its debut, even though it did have quite a few improvements over the original Exacta, it still lacked an automatic diaphragm. There was no meter available for it, no motor drive. So although an improved camera and very pretty, I love the way these things look, this would have been the closest we'll ever see to a modern Exacta. But any Exacta is good. I love the original ones. I have They call these the vest pocket exactas. This is actually called an exacta night. I read one time that because it's black, there you go, Paul's got one. You were incorrect to assume that the exacta nights were black. Like I could see why you might think that, but that's not true. They made exacta nights in both black and chrome bodies, and they made non-exacta nights in black and chrome too. What night meant was it came with, there's your biotar. You would get it with a faster, this is an 8 centimeter f2 biotar. There were one or two other lenses that were made for the exacta night. And although the mount is exactly the same, the vest pocket exactas use a screw mount. It does not have the exacta bayonet mount. It's still a screw mount. If you look, see this thing that goes around, I'm rotating it. On the nights, it's much bigger. And the reason it's bigger is because the physical size of the lens is bigger, and they needed to make it bigger to clear the ring. So you can actually mount non-night lenses to an exacta night body and vice versa. But I think the scales are like upside down, and you'll have trouble rotating the ring if you don't have the right combination of lenses. So the 127 vest pocket exactas use a screw mount. The 35 millimeter exactas use the exacta mount. The exacta real uses an exacta real mount. I posted on the forum just the other day. I was even stumped. I had these lenses that I thought looked exactly like a larger version of the exacta mount. It even had this indexing pin that they always have. And I think it was Eric Cass-Lewis who correctly was the first person who identified as this is the lens for the Exacta 66, the pre-war version. Then they made a post-war version, which you have, Paul. That has a different mount. Again, it doesn't use this mount. If you could go back in time, maybe, and talk to Mr. Steenbergen and say, hey, if there's one way to make your company better, stop making so many damn mounts, because they're all different. I don't think there were ever two different series of Exactas that shared a mount, other than maybe, like, I guess if you consider the VXs.
So they were like the Mamiya of the so,
Yeah, I think I counted once
yeah.
before, and Mamiya had like 14 different lens mounts.
Nikon made, of course, screw mount lenses of the Leica screw mount, and they also made their mount. They also made lenses for Bronica. We all know that. But did anybody really know that they also made a lens for Exacta? This is the 135-35 Nikkor that was made for the rangefinder cameras. They took that lens, they shortened the barrel because of the thicker body, and put an Exacta mount on it. This is the only lens they ever made for Exacta. And why they made it, nobody knows.
Would it have worked on a Topcon?
Yes, it's an Exacta mount, but it was made for Exacta. It's advertised. If you look at the magazines from like the mid 50s to late 50s here in the States, they're actually advertised Exacta mount.
Being a Japanese company, do you think they made that for the Topcon market?
I don't know. I've never seen a Topcon with one. I've never seen anybody even connected to it, really. You're the first one to ever bring it up.
What were the numbers, Bob? Did you ever see a number? How many they made?
No, there's no way of knowing. The thing is that the 135-35, of course, was made in the hundreds of thousands, but it has a full-fledged Exacta mount on the back. Even came with an Exacta rear mount, rear cap. It's the exact same lens as they made for the rangefinder Nikons, except it's about a half-inch shorter because of the body length. So it's a manual lens. I mean, it's not even a preset. But the thing is, nobody knows why they made it. Was Exacta that big a seller in Japan? I don't know.
Well, the Exacta was actually extremely popular in Japan. In fact, the Japanese companies were one of the first third-party manufacturers to produce lenses in Exacta mount. And some of them were for cameras like this. This is called the First Flex 35. Yes. I don't offhand remember who made this camera, but it uses, I'll get it off in a second here. It uses the Exacta mount. So this is a Japanese SLR. It's a 1-speed shutter. The shutter speed is controlled by this little lever. You have either 125 or bulb, and that's it. Only 2 speeds.
When did that come out?
I think this is late 50s, I guess. I honestly don't know.
1955.
55?
Wow.
Okay.
Tokiwa Seiki.
There's an early version of the First Flex and then a second version. This is the second. I know this is a later one. So maybe the early version was 55. But nevertheless, this is an early Exacta mount Japanese camera. So I could take this lens and I could mount it to what Phil's holding up there, the Topcon, which obviously uses the Exacta mount. You could mount this to any Exacta. Robert, you mentioned Nippon Kungaku made a lens in exact amount, but so did Canon. Canon made one,
Yes, they
ironically,
did. Yes, they did.
not for an actual exacta. Who did they make it for?
Trying to remember. I remember seeing it.
It was Mamiya. They made it for
Yeah,
Mamiya
okay.
for there was a couple different cameras that they made that used the exact amount.
Prismat or something, maybe the Prismat or something
One of the
like that.
right, it was one of the Prismats. There was a tower version, a Sears tower
Yeah.
version that had it too. And what I had read in Peter Decker is well known for his rangefinder book, but he actually did make an SLR book. It was far less common. He mentioned in there that at one time Mamiya and Canon had the exact same distributor. So Canon, I think, produced that lens as a favor to their distributor just so they'd have one more lens that they could sell with it. So the exact amount, a lot of people, we've talked even on this show, why did Tokyo Kagaku release the Topcon with the exact amount? In my opinion, that was one of the reasons the camera just never really caught on.
Bad decision. Bad decision.
But it in hindsight, yes, I agree with you. But at the time, it probably seemed like a smart decision though, because when did the first Topcon R come out? 56? Maybe
Something like that.
57. So that's still, 2-3 years before anybody, most other Japanese companies are producing these SLRs. Anybody who wants to spend that kind of money in a Japanese SLR doesn't want to invest in a whole new lens mount. So knowing that the exact amount was already well established and there were millions of people both in Japan and elsewhere shooting them, they took an approach saying, well, all right, we're going to create our own SLR, but we're going to make it compatible with these German lenses that are optically good. They believe Japanese lenses were good too, but remember, you still have to market it. And even by the mid 50s, there were still people in certain areas of the world that just simply didn't trust Japanese manufacturers. So if you wanted to buy a Topcon, but you already had an exacta, you might be more willing to give it a shot than if it had its own lens mount. I mean, I think the bigger problem with Topcon is that they were slow to innovate. Well, they did make really good cameras, and the RE Super, I think, bested the Nikon F because the way the meter worked, it would work. You could read the meter even with the waist level finder, whereas the Nikon F, you couldn't do that. So in that regard, the RE, and I still think the RE has one of the smoothest film transports of any camera I've ever used. So I guess if we go back to East Germany, I mean, there's so many brands. Here's a weird one. Get out your orange juice and champagne, everybody, because I have a mimosa. This camera is misleadingly small. It's still a 35 millimeter camera, but it's very thick front to back. And how they were able to make it so small is you open up the film compartment and it has a hinged pressure plate, but the film spools kind of wrap around the sides. So instead of the film going in a straight line from spool to spool, it kind of wraps around at like not quite a 90-degree angle, but kind of, maybe like a 60-degree angle. So the camera's thicker front to back, but it's narrower side to side because the spools are kind of tucked in more towards the front. But it resembles a box camera. In fact, the first time I had ever seen one of these things online, I just assumed it was a box camera. And then when I learned it was 35 millimeter, I'm like, well, that looks like the dimensions just don't match right in my head. So, that's kind of a strange.
It's a fascinating camera, isn't it?
Fascinating camera. And there's a Mimosa 1 and a Mimosa 2. This is the 2. The only difference, as far as I'm aware, is the Mimosa 2 has a through the body viewfinder that physically goes through it, whereas the Mimosa 1 has a viewfinder that sticks up on top, but otherwise they're about the same. Oh, I forgot. One other kind of neat exacta trivia. It's not really an exacta, but this is a camera I found in Kurt's collection. So there was the exactas, which were very, very popular, but then they also in 1950 came out with a camera called the Exa. So the Exa was essentially a scaled down version of the exacta. It's physically smaller. It doesn't have a traditional shutter. It uses what's called a trap shutter, where essentially there's a plate that's attached to the reflex mirror. And as you fire it, the mirror goes up and it exposes the film. And then when it's done, it goes back down again, ending the exposure. So it essentially the mirror becomes the shutter, but it's limited to a top speed of only 1/150th. So when you look at an Exa, you'll see a 25, a 50, a 100, and a 150. And I don't think any of them went faster than that. But it does share the interchangeable pentaprisms. And it does have the exact same lens mount. So this would have been kind of like a step up camera in Nikon world, like a Nikkor X sort of, or Nikkormat even. This specific EXA though is different from most of them, and it says System EXA, and below that it says Rheinmetall Somerda. And this camera at one point was so popular that the factory where Ihagee was making these couldn't keep up. So they basically outsourced manufacturing of these cameras to a completely different factory that essentially made a copy of them. So this is not made by Ihagee at all. This is made by a completely different company, but it's essentially a copy of the Exacta using the same mount, same body castings, same lenses, everything about it's the same. But if you're an Exacta or EXA collector, the System EXA is a very uncommon, and I don't think they made a lot of these, even though it was meant to help add additional capacity to the factories who were overloaded. They ended up not producing these for very long.
I do love the stick shift speed adjustment.
Yeah.
I wish more cameras had that.
It's literally just a lever that goes forward and backwards, and that's it. Because it's essentially just slowing down the speed at which the mirror goes up and down. It won't show on the zoom, but if you actually watch the shutter fire, you actually see this plate that's under the mirror that just goes up and down.
The thing with the Exacta is, one thing we sort of do have to say is the Exacta and the EXA, they are not just cameras, they're actually works of art. The detail that's gone into designing the way they actually look, not just operate, is just outstanding. I mean, you won't find any manufacturer do that kind of work, effectively a consumer good these days.
The Varex gets a lot of people griping about the weird ergonomics on it. The fact that it shoots from the left-hand side, the fact that the wind lever on it goes like 180 degrees, but in the front firing shutter release. But I love shooting my Varex. The Biotar on it is fantastic. I've got a range of lenses for it from a number of different manufacturers, and I'm lucky to have one that's in perfect working order. And it just looks, you're right, it looks like a museum piece.
They're gorgeous.
It's wonderful to handle. Although is that the Tessar that's on yours, Theo?
That is the Tessar, yes, the 5 centimeter 3.5.
You need to get a properly sized lens on the front of that camera. You need to get a Biotar on there because that throws the lines off.
Take that lens, Theo. Do you have a Topcon?
I do. I've got Topcon with pretty much every lens the Topcon made.
Put that lens on the Topcon and it looks hilariously out of place.
The weird sort of triangular shape to the sides of the camera. There's just so much about that camera that the engineering details, maybe it's over engineered, I don't know, but the feeling of that camera, it's of a class of its own.
It's something that I don't know how many people use it a ton, but the slow speed governor would allow you to shoot 12-second exposures without a cable release. Like you can shoot anywhere from 12 seconds up to 1/1000th. And I mean, it took, even in the 70s and 80s, in the beginning of the electronic era of SLRs, you usually didn't see an SLR that could shoot an exposure longer than 4, maybe 8 seconds. So, you're talking about a camera from the 30s that had the ability to shoot 12-second exposures on its own without having to use a cable release. And the sound, I don't know if you've ever actually fired it using the 12-second, hearing that, and then eventually it goes as it's like winding down. It just, the auditory groans that it makes are very appealing. But I agree with you, Anthony. They are gorgeous. They're very collectible. There's so many different kinds. Even the later, when they did redesign them in the 60s with the block letter, and the zebra lenses, I think they're still gorgeous. Ergonomically, they can be a little tough. I mean, they're heavy. If you're not used to using your left finger to fire the shutter, the early ones, the Film Advance was a very long throw.
It's like 180 degrees.
Oh, it's longer than that. The earlier ones go, I mean, I have one right here. It goes, I mean, I'd say like almost 270 degrees.
Yeah, it goes all the way around.
It goes, they actually did change that. That's one of the improvements they did on the block letter ones. The later ones, Anthony, are closer to 180. Yeah, even now they go past that still. but it's not quite as far.
Do we even talk about the razor blade though?
The razor blade, yeah.
That's the one thing with the exactas that always I have a bit of a chuckle with is they actually had a razor blade in the actual camera.
What would you use that for?
I believe it was to actually cut film.
Right. So you could change roles halfway through shooting.
Yeah.
So a lot of cameras back then did cassette to cassette film transport, but you still needed to finish the roll or make a note of where you left off, rewind it, then take it out, swap it, put it back in, and then go back to where you left off. But with the exactas, you could be halfway through your roll. You just pull this lever up and it's got a little hook. It's like a tiny little sickle with a razor blade tooth, like a tiny velociraptor finger. Yeah. And it would just slice through the film. And then all you would do is just rewind it just a tiny bit to get the end back in the cassette. And then you could pull the cassette, the exposed cassette out, develop that, and then the unexposed cassette you could then reuse again later if you wanted to. The KMZ Start had a blade like that too.
And you can't mention the Exacta without giving a nod to Rear Window in the Hitchcock film where Jimmy Stewart's using a blacked out version, or contractually, I'm not sure why they taped over the Exacta markings on it. But was that a kill fit lens?
It was a kill fit, yeah. I think it was a 400 millimeter, like an f5.6, I think. That lens is worth a pretty penny for that exact reason. People want that lens from that movie. It was an uncommon lens to begin with, but because of its use in that movie, you can get the 300, which looks similar. It's not as big. If you want to flash it around to people who don't know the movie that well, you could probably mistake the 300 for the 400. But if you want the one he actually used in the apartment taking pictures across the courtyard, you need to get the 400.
Which is creepy, by the way.
It is.
Please don't do that. We don't endorse that behavior.
Peeping Tom. Okay, so here's a question for you: is how do you spell Exacta?
EXAKTA,
which is true, but you'll sometimes see people spell it with a C instead of a K. But that's not wrong. They actually sold it both ways. So you can find some Exactas. They have one right here. For a short while, they did make them with a C. So while the K is still the more accurate way, and people who use a C probably don't know this. So it's not like they're like, oh, well, it was both ways. You can't actually say that's wrong, though, because they did sell them both ways. Another thing which I find fun is people on eBay who don't actually know anything about these cameras. They always say the name of the company is Ihagee because the German script, the traditional way of writing a capital I, had a little hook on it, exactly like a J. But it's not Ihagee. It truly is Ihagee. So you have the Ihagee Exacta with a C. You could say that both C and K are correct, although they're pronounced the same.
Let me ask you a question here with Exacta.
Sure.
I collect a bit of Topcon. I guess in order to sort of finalize the cameras that I do have, I looked at the Topcon RE300, which I believe that was their last camera that was released.
Yep, the end.
So I found on eBay an Exacta, which was, I'm not exactly sure, but it's essentially the same camera with different plates on it. But Japanese-made camera, mind you. But what exactly happened to Exacta? I'm just curious because of that. I know that the one that I do have is Japanese-made, and it had a variable 35 to...
Is it this one?
No,
Okay.
It is not. Yeah, I just strictly bought it just as I was mainly interested in the RE300, and it was virtually the same camera.
I believe you. I'm sure there was a Japanese-made Exacta that was probably based off of the Topcon, which probably wasn't made in Germany anyway. Or I'm sorry, was probably made by somebody else anyway. I don't know a lot about it. But the reason I asked if it's this one, I mentioned earlier about the Ihagee Real, the Ihagee West Exacta Real. I said they made two cameras. The Exacta Real was the first one, and this was the second one. The problem is by the time they tried to make this camera called the Exacta Twin TL, it still has the Ihagee logo. But this is actually a Japanese camera. It's made in Japan by, I think, Shannon?
I think so.
Maybe it was Cosina. It was one of those companies. I can't remember which one off the top of my head. But this is a Japanese camera, Japanese lens, still has the Exacta name. It uses the same mount. So this has the bayonet mount. So I could swap this lens with the lens from the one I just showed you earlier. But then they also made a version of this camera with the M42 mount too. By that point, they had jumped the shark. The company had given up. It was clear it was never going to go anywhere. But to answer your question, I don't know much about that other than I know that the RE300 is by most accounts is no longer a true Top Con anymore.
Oh no, by no means is it.
Yeah. If you want, like Ira Cohen loves to do Alpha Omega cameras where like the first and the last, like that would be the last.
That's why I bought it. As well as it had kind of a neat lens, a 35 to 100
Yeah.
millimeter, which I've never seen before. So
Mhm.
the price was right.
Here's another Exacta with the metered prism. It has, what do we call these neck straps, Paul? These are the hair rippers.
Oh yeah.
You put this thing on your neck and you move it a couple times and it shaves the back of your head like a baby's butt, completely rips out all the hair, because these things are vicious. I don't know how anybody ever used these things. So we're running short on time here. This episode kind of meandered all over the place. There's a lot of really great stories about the East German camera industry. If you don't dive too deep into the East German cameras, it could be easy to mistake a lot of them as less expensive, less quality build quality, less quality lenses than many of the other West German or even Japanese makes. But I like, there's a lot to like about this market. I already shared with you that Praktica. I like the VL series. These are nice cameras. They're attractive. This one has a removable prism. I don't have one handy, but they had a Pentacon Exacta called the 1000 RTL, which is a good looking camera too. They have great images, whether you're talking about ones that use the Exacta mount or M42 mount. There's a lot of good options there. A lot of the less common ones really didn't get much into the Certos and Baldas. Pre-war, Certas and Baldas were like on the level of like a Kodak Retina. In fact, there were a couple Weltas that if you kind of look at them at a glance, they look like a Retina. They're very easy to be mistaken for one. You can get them with a lot of different kinds of Schneider, Zeiss lenses, a lot of the same lenses and such like that. Anything else that I missed, guys, that we wanted to cover?
I think we covered we did mention the actual Practi earlier, but I think we just have to play what a good East German early motor wine sounds like. So I'm just going to put that on.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, so he's going to use the Penty with the motor drive. Go for
it. The
Practi. I keep saying it wrong. We got the Adiron from last episode.
It's the Joy Buzzer. It's the Joy Buzzer camera.
So anyway, a couple bit of housekeeping. In the last, actually 2 episodes ago, when we had Jesse on, we talked about trying to connect the older generation with the newer generation. And he was saying a lot of younger people don't go on Facebook. And that's pretty much where a lot of our listeners come from. So it was suggested that we consider doing like a Discord server. So we actually did create a Discord server. It was right around the recording of the other show, so we didn't get a chance to talk about it. But we do have a Discord server. We've set it up. I like it. I've seen some of the benefits of it. You have, your stream of conscious, we have the lounge where anybody can just drop in and say hi, do whatever they want. But we have a couple forums where people can share their gas, post pictures of cameras they've had. People can comment on it. We have a section where you could share your photography that you've shot with some of your old cameras. We have a section called Ask the Hosts. We actually did get a question from somebody who wanted to know if there's any good German books about the German camera industry. And I did actually look to see if I could find anything, and I don't know of one. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff specific to Leica. There's a lot of stuff specific to Zeiss and brand specific stuff, but I was unable to find a book that's literally the history of the German camera industry. I would suspect that anything remotely useful would be ridiculously long. But that was a good question though. So if you have any questions that you want to bring up here, that's a good place to ask. Obviously, we're still very active on the Facebook page, but check out our Discord server. It's not discoverable at this point, so we have to have at least 1,000 members before they'll allow us to be discoverable. But we have the join link in the Facebook page. I'll include it in the show notes of this show too, but it's just another way to interact with us. And if it allows us to expand on the number of people that we can engage with and get some more listeners, then I'm all for it. I do have a plan for the next show. We're going to record in 2 weeks. which is going to be on November 27th at our usual time. I can't say who it is because I don't want to jinx it, but I think the next episode is going to be really awesome. I'm really, really looking forward to speaking to this guest. He's a big time camera collector that knows a lot about collecting cameras and just all the different models, makes. I think you guys will be impressed with the stories. So more to come on that episode. But anything else you guys want to say before we go?
We're all good.
We're all good. Well, as always, the topics and discussions on the Camerosity podcast are influenced by you guys. So please continue to offer suggestions. But what's more useful is for you to come on the show and actually talk to us. I certainly love to talk, but I'd rather listen to you guys. I really do enjoy, after we edit these shows, listening to the episodes and hearing some of the engagements and questions that people ask. Some of the best diversions we've ever had have come from people who've joined the show and we didn't plan on. So I look forward to talking to you guys again. Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show. Phil, thanks for coming back. Bob already said he had to go. So didn't have a lot of people join this time, but we're looking forward to you guys returning and having more guests to talk to. So have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
See you, fellas.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Theo. My circuit breaker popped
Oh, geez.
in my computer just when the sump pump in the basement kicked on, which is not a good sign.
No, it's not. It should be isolated from the rest of your house.
I don't think Anthony's going to be too. His exact message: "Fucking Bluetooth keyboard died. Trying to find another USB one that works."
There we go. There's Anthony. Apparently he got a new keyboard.
Got it working.
We thought maybe you had just taken a nap.
I did fall asleep.
We wouldn't blame you if you did.
My circuit breaker just popped again. I got to go see what's going on here. I'll be back.
Man, I've got to find a job. It's what a contracting wise, what a shitty time of year.
I think I swallowed an ant.